Hi, hello, assalamu alaikum, brother Zachary. Welcome to the Eon platform. Brother Zachary is a student of the Near Eastern Studies or the Middle Eastern Studies, and he's a PhD from Princeton. Your dissertation was titled "The Invention of Palestine." I am quite provocative, I have to say so myself. I would you like to introduce yourself and maybe then get into your personal journey as an American uh, individual of Jewish descent, and then your further foray into academia?
First of all, thanks so much for having me on. And yeah, I'd be happy to talk about my own personal journey. I grew up in the American suburban Midwest in a Jewish household, going to Jewish schools and Jewish summer camps and Jewish youth groups. In fact, I even went to Israel with my Jewish youth group in high school. And and it was those experiences that led me further and further down the Israel Palestine rabbit hole. And so during my university years, I spent a semester abroad in Jerusalem. And it was then when I was first exposed to a side of Israel Palestine that I previously had never been exposed to before. I found myself in a Hebrew language class with a bunch of Palestinians from East Jerusalem, people who I assumed were dangerous and violent and terrorists based on my upbringing. It turned out all of those assumptions were false. In fact, those were the friendliest, nicest people in the class. And so I got more and more interested in Palestine and Palestinian history, started learning Arabic. And I think the more you learn about the history of Israel Palestine and the history of Zionism, the more sympathetic you become to the Palestinians. Because I think what you learn over time is that Zionists encountered a question. Every single Zionist, as far as I can tell, from 1880 to 1948, asked themselves the same question, which is how is it that we are going to establish a Jewish state in a country that is majority non-Jewish, that is majority Palestinian Arab? What are we going to do with all these Palestinians? Every single major Zionist thinker and Zionist political leader from 1880 to 1948 asked that question. Some of them thought that the Palestinians would leave voluntarily. Some of them thought that they could incentivize Palestinians to move to Jordan, to move to Egypt or Syria or Lebanon. I think the majority of them realized that Palestinians had a national identity just like the Jews did, that Palestinians had deep roots in the country, that Palestinians were not prepared to submit to Jewish domination. And
So,
so they realized that they would have to expel Palestinians by force, which is exactly what happened in 1948.
so a nation for people without a nation, right? That was sort of the. I'm paraphrasing the slogan. I'm probably butchering it. But you think that that sort of that cognitive dissonance was always there in the background of even the early Zionist movement. And you, as a young Jewish person growing up in America, did you feel sort of betrayed by the sort of the inherent violence that this ideology brought to your people and to other indigenous people in Palestine or the surrounding regions of Egypt or Syria or Lebanon? Was this a personal sort of was it in one would assume it was tied up to your sort of teenage rebellion or something like that? Maybe your parents stack it up to that, but was it something more for
I
you?
think I think the narrative of Zionism that I was raised with was one in which the Zionists were the heroes. They drained the swamps. They turned desert. They made the desert bloom. This land was barren and empty and desolate, and they built this beautiful, vibrant, uh, tech savvy, entrepreneurial state in the Middle East, surrounded by autocratic states. It's the only democracy in the Middle East, right? Those are the narratives that we are raised with in Zionist and Jewish circles in the United States. And I think the more you study history, the more you realize that that narrative is fiction. That yeah, of course the Zionists did all these things, but of course they built a country. But in the process of building that country, in the process of draining the swamps, in the process of making the desert bloom, they also displaced many Palestinian Arabs and destroyed 500 Palestinian Arab villages in 1948 and imposed a brutal military occupation on 5 million Palestinians over the course of the last 56 years. and are continuing that process of displacing Palestinians and destroying their homes and confiscating their land and expelling them from the country. And that's been ongoing since the origins of Zionism, and especially since 1948. I mean, people forget that in the years after 1948, right? So we're talking that Israel is a state. They've already expelled 750,000 Palestinians. The 1948 war is over, but still for another 6 to 9 months from November, December 1948 until the following November, December 1949, Israel expelled the inhabitants of another 36 Palestinian villages. The process of ethnic cleansing continued after the war ended. And it continued again in 1967 when Israel depopulated another dozen some Palestinian villages and expelled another 250,000 Palestinians. And then the process continued again from 1967 to 1987, during which Israel expelled another 2,000 Palestinians from the occupied territories. And the process has been ongoing ever since 1987. It's shifted. I think over the past 3 decades now, the process of depopulating Palestinians is now, it's a more intricate, a more complex process in which Israel first pushes Palestinians from areas B and C in the West Bank to areas A. And then from area A in the West Bank, they want to push them to Jordan or to Gaza. And then once they're all in Gaza, they want to push them out to Egypt or to the Mediterranean Sea. This is another trend that I think has not really been reported on much, but really you have masses of Palestinians leaving Gaza over the past few years, getting on boats, doing the same thing that the Eritreans and the Somalis and other Africans have been doing for over a decade now, is getting on a boat, braving the high seas, and hoping for a better life in Europe. But that's now happening in Gaza as well. So Israel has continued this process of pushing out Palestinians, of destroying their homes, of confiscating their land. And it's been ongoing for the past 75 years. And of course, it's easier to expel Palestinians during war than it is during peacetime. And that's why in 48 and 67 and 2023, you have mass expulsions. Whereas between 48 and 67 and between 67 and 2003, you have smaller expulsions that happen at the level of the individual village or even the individual home. But it's been an ongoing process, and it all comes back to one basic premise, which is Zionism is the idea that Jews should have political control over Palestine. And in a land that is majority Palestinian Arab, even today, between the river and the sea, there are actually more Palestinians than there are Jews. So in a world where you have more Palestinians than Jews, but you want to create a Jewish state with Jewish control and Jewish sovereignty, what place do Palestinians have in that state?
Now, I'm speaking with Zachary, the historian, right now. But what about the young Zachary, as a young person growing up? How you talked about the expulsions? How were these sort of narratives even presented? That's what I'm trying to understand here. Your personal journey. So you're growing up, you're going to Jewish school, and this shouldn't, just for the audience and maybe for your ears as well, this shouldn't give you extra legitimacy to be able to speak about this. I mean, anyone and everyone who interacts with this, Jewish and otherwise, should be able to comment on the fact that the Zionist project is a colonial European colonial, settler colonial apartheid sort of setup. That you don't have to have a special sort of status of, because this identity politics around, if you criticize the Zionist project, or if you have any criticism of Israel, maybe that you're an anti-Semite or so. But given that context, did you, as a young person, feel, how were you presented these narratives? Why were these people being expelled? Somehow this was justified because these people weren't tilling the land properly, or they weren't draining the swamps well enough, or the desert wasn't green enough. What was the narrative that was presented? Or were these occupiers? Were these the Romans that maybe that expelled the Jews for the first time maybe 2,000-3,000 years ago? What was the sort of argumentation being presented?
Generally speaking, I would say Jewish education in the United States completely ignores and omits the Palestinians altogether. It's not that we're taught that, the Arabs were lazy, or the Arabs were backwards, or the Arabs were unproductive. No, we're not taught anything about them. As far as we know, they don't exist. They're not part of the curriculum. We're not taught about them at all. The only thing we know about them is that they hate Jews and they want to blow us up.
So,
That's it.
so
There's
before,
no there's
I'm
no
sorry, I'm gonna have
teaching
to
around.
cut you off, but where were they before the Nakba? Before 48, where were they?
I mean, you have to realize if you're an American Jewish kid going to the Zionist summer camp or Zionist after school programming at the synagogue, or or if you're involved in the Zionist youth group, you're not taught about Palestinian history. You just have no idea. What you know is Zionist history and Zionist immigration and Zionist heroic efforts. But you just don't know anything about the Palestinian Arabs other than they want to blow you up on a bus or in a cafe. That's all
Okay,
you know
so
about them.
these heroic narratives of Zionists fighting to take their land back, who are they taking it from? I mean, it just seems a bit like this sort of cognitive dissonance that a young Zionist growing up in, I feel almost a sort of pity for them, like growing up with this sort of thinking of that nobody existed on this land prior to them showing up in the 40s or maybe in the 20s even, if their ancestors showed up in the 1920s even, or even earlier.
I think there's a few things to keep in mind here. One of which is that there's a tremendous emphasis on Jewish suffering in Europe. And so the history of Zionism and the history and Jewish history is taught as follows. For thousands of years, Jews have faced unending persecution. Okay, no matter where they go, whether it's whether it's Spain in the Middle Ages where they faced inquisitions, or whether it's in the rest of Europe during the Middle Ages where they were put into ghettos, or whether it's the late 19th and early 20th century where there are pogroms where every few years in places like Ukraine, in Odessa, in places like the Pale Settlement, which is today Poland, the police and the Tsarist regime come in with the support of the government and slaughter however many hundreds or thousands of Jews, and that is kind of the narrative. Right. And so if you're taught that, of course, you're going to come to believe that, yeah, Jews need a place where they can feel safe. And what other place would that be other than the place Jews have been praying to return to for 2,000 years? Right. So that's the narrative. And it's very a powerful narrative. And then, as you're taught about the rise in anti-Semitism in Europe, especially in Nazi Germany in the 1930s, what Jew wouldn't come to the conclusion that we need a state of Israel to protect the Jews? I mean, that's the most obvious conclusion from this narrative. Now, I mean, my response to that is there is no state in the world that is making Jews more unsafe today than the state of Israel. Okay. And we've seen that just in the past 3 weeks, whereby Israel goes on this genocidal rampage where it declares that its goal in Gaza is not precision, but it is damage. It states that Palestinians are human animals. It prevents all water, food, and electricity from entering Gaza for 3 weeks. And don't tell me the 40 trucks that have been allowed in is any type of remedy to that. No, this is what Roz Siegel, Israeli PhD and genocide scholar, calls a textbook case of genocide. Okay, so when Israel commits a textbook case of genocide, guess what happens? Jews around the world face anti-Semitism, because the state of Israel claims to speak and represent Jews around the world. It claims to be a Jewish state. It claims to protect Jews. It claims to be a homeland for Jews. So of course Jews are going to face retribution abroad, just like Muslims face retribution whenever some Muslim does something horrible, or just like whenever, in Pakistan and India, whenever, Hindus do something against Muslims or Muslims do something against Hindus, the group that is identified as the one carrying out the atrocity, that group faces retribution. We saw this, by the way, after COVID, when it was called the China virus, and there was all this anti-Asian hate in the United States against Chinese people. And we see this and we saw this in World War II in the United States. We interned Japanese Americans. We put them in concentration camps because of Pearl Harbor. So groups always face backlash and retribution whenever their group is perceived to have done something wrong. And right now, so you have the Jewish state of Israel committing these grotesque acts of violence, and it's Jews who are facing the consequences abroad and as well in Israel. I mean, why do you think it is that 1,400 Israelis died in Israel? Why do you think it is Hamas is carrying out these grotesque acts of violence against Israeli civilians? It's because they've been blockaded for 16 years. They've been living in a state of siege for 16 years. They've been living under brutal Israeli military occupation for 56 years. But guess what? Violence breeds violence. And so, because the state of Israel was founded on, in a very violent way, by uprooting and expelling hundreds of thousands of Palestinians, and because now it's been maintaining control over 5 million Palestinians, denying them political rights, denying them the right to vote for the government that controls their lives. And when you do that, and when you deny millions of people basic human rights, you put them on a diet, as Israelis call in Gaza. You blockade them, you prevent them from having fresh water, from having an economy. You make 80% of people in Gaza dependent on food handouts. What the hell did you think was going to happen? You treat people subhuman for decades. Guess what? A small number of them commit subhuman acts. So I think Israel, in its attempt to claim to be representing Jewish people, and in its attempt to build this Jewish state and say we represent Jews everywhere, it's actually endangering Jews everywhere. And that's what we're at today, which is that the Jewish state founded to protect Jews is actually the single greatest threat to Jews in Israel and everywhere else in the world.
Well, unpack the sort of historical threat that Israel has created for Jewish community in Israel as well as abroad by attacking the not only the Arabs of Palestine, but also specifically Muslims. So they have 2 billion co-religionists all over the world, and then they feel the need to maybe attack the group that is attacking, their in-group. So you see that in Dagestan right now. So you see that 400 to 500 protesters broke into the airport and they were trying to take down some airline that was potentially carrying people who are fleeing from the conflict in Israel, because a lot of Israeli settlers have dual citizenships, which I find hilarious. But you see a constant rise on social media as well as physically in Europe and in America. You see a rise in anti-Semitism, and not from Muslims, from far right Christian groups, because they now have an excuse to bring up those sorts of pre-World War II or post-World War II type of fascist sort of tendencies that exist in Europe and in America. You historically mentioned all these pogroms and issues that the Jewish community has suffered, unfortunately, which is a reality. I have two questions about that. As a young Jew growing up in America, and as an adult even, do they have an awareness, an astute sort of awareness? Do Israeli Jews have an astute, or American Jews even, have an astute awareness that they had a much better lot in terms of, and this is in relative terms, obviously, I'm not saying in absolute terms, but they had a much better lot in sort of, in Ottoman territories or in Muslim territories in general. And then when they were facing the Spanish Inquisition, so were Muslims. North Africans and Moors were also being kicked out of Spain and Portugal. And lo and behold, where did everyone end up? They ended up in North Africa. And they lived side by side under Muslim rule fairly, prosperously. And in fact, Muslim Spain is when the Jewish community produced Maimonides, who is the sort of if I had to say it in Muslim terms, the Mufti Azam of the Grand Mufti of the sort of the Jewish tradition, and that is described as sort of the academic Jewish golden era of literature and academia in terms of religious scripture and exegesis. That's the first question. Are Jews astutely aware of this, and how do they deal with this? How do they reconcile this, and in their current treatment of fellow Muslims or even as humans? Secondly, when they have this narrative of a certain amount of victimhood, and I say this with a lot of with a pinch of salt, because I know it's unfair to say victimhood, because there is a sincere victimization that they've suffered in the Holocaust and prior to the Holocaust. But when you have an astute sort of sense of this victimhood, as a state policy for Israel, it's a victim state basically. How'd that work out for Israel and the individuals who comprise of Israel? I mean, people like you, when you go to Israel and you grew up there in America and then going to and back and forth between Israel, how do you sort of reconcile this sort of this victimhood narrative, but at the same time you have everything of Europe and the Western civilization that it has to offer, and in a modern context. And then you look at the Palestinians maybe and the Gazans maybe, and then, I mean, don't they ever sort of realize that maybe we're not victims anymore?
Let me start with the first question, and then we'll come back to this question of victimhood. I think historians are more or less unanimous on this point that Jews fared much better in under Muslim rule than under Christian rule from the bird's eye view. When you're looking at history writ large over the past 1,000 years, did Jews do better under Muslim rule or Christian rule? I can't think of a single historian who would say Jews did better under Christian rule. No, they clearly did better under
I can
Muslim
think
rule.
of one, Bibi Netanyahu,
Okay, well,
because he's
sure,
also a Holocaust divisionist. Sorry for the interruption.
yeah, but he's not
Because
a historian. He's not a historian. He does not have.
he's an astute historian. He's a very deep intellectual. He figured out that the Holocaust was orchestrated by the Grand Mufti of Palestine. You know, this guy.
Has he published any peer reviewed papers in
I
on
feel like
history? That's my question.
after this massacre, maybe he'll get back to his books.
What a historian does is a historian goes into the archives, looks at the diaries and the memoirs and the primary sources and tries to make sense of what happened in the past and tries to be honest and I don't believe Bibi Netanyahu has done any of those things. Now, to the question of, you know, are Jews aware that Jews have generally speaking done better under a Muslim rule than Christian rule? I think the answer is yes, they are. But I don't think they really fully appreciate it because, you know, you have to think about what life was like in those decades prior to the rise of Zionism in Ottoman Palestine. Okay. And, you had in places like Jerusalem, you had Christians, Muslims, and Jews in Jerusalem living on the same streets, living in the same buildings. Their kids played in the same courtyards. You have Amos Oz, a very famous Israeli novelist. He relates some anecdotes shared to him by his father in his memoir, in which his father is telling him that he played with Muslims in the same courtyard and they ganged up against other Jews and other Muslims from other courtyards. The fault lines were not Muslim and Jewish in some cases. Okay. In places like Jaffa, in Manshia, you had wealthy Jews and wealthy Palestinian Arabs living side by side. You even had Jews and Muslims and Christians celebrating each other's holidays together. And this might come as a surprise to many people, but in places like Sheikh Jarrah, which has today been the site of an ethnic cleansing campaign to push out the Palestinian residents, but just go back 120 years, you had Muslims joining Jews to picnic in Sheikh Jarrah by at a tombstone of a I think is it Rav Shimon Bar Yochai or we'll have to we can put in the show notes the name of the Jewish mystic who's buried in Sheikh Jarrah. But Muslims and Jews would celebrate Jewish holidays together. Jews would join Muslims on Ramadan. So, I mean, this is the world. This was Ottoman Palestine. They all shared a common Ottoman identity. Jews and Muslims and Christians shared a common Ottoman identity as late as 1911. Okay, so this is 2 decades into the process of Zionist immigration. This is, a decade and a half after the first Zionist Congress, during which Theodor Herzl and Max Nordau declared that the goal of Zionism was to establish a Jewish state. So 15 years after that, you have Palestinian Arabs in Jaffa, the Isa cousins, found this newspaper in 1911 in which they are hiring Jewish writers, Zionist Jewish writers, to write for their magazine. And they're doing it quietly because they know it's controversial, but the reason was because they shared a common Ottoman vision. They all believed that Ottoman citizenship and Ottoman identity and Ottoman loyalty was more important than those fault lines between the Zionists and the Palestinian Arabs, and that it was their duty together, to help basically, help facilitate and give rise to this shared sense of Ottomanism and Ottoman loyalty, and that's why they hired the Zionist Jewish writer. And there's been some interesting literature published about this. But the point I'm trying to make here is that it didn't have to turn out this way. It didn't have to turn out the way it did. And I think if we go back to a world in which, in which neither Jews nor Muslims nor Christians claim that they have the right to rule over Palestine, if we get rid of that idea altogether, that a particular religio-ethnic group, be it Palestinian or Jewish, that they have exclusive right to this land, that they have a right to dominate and create an ethno-nation state in their land, if we just get rid of that idea and say, look, we have Jews and Muslims and Christians here, we have Palestinian Arabs, and we have Israelis, and they're all equal, and there's no benefit, there's no privilege given to any of those groups over any of the other groups. I mean, I think that is ultimately really a vision that I think maybe no one's happy with, but at least it would end the bloodshed. And that's kind of where I stand, which is, can we build a state that is dedicated to the safety and security and rights of its citizens, period, no matter what their religion or ethnic identity is.
So some sort of international Holy See or a Vatican type situation, you have some sort of one state solution in your mind, it seems, almost, where all citizenry is equal regardless of sort of ethnic or religious background. So the Bedouins, the Christians, the Palestinian Christians, the Arabs, as well as the Jews, whether they be Sephardic or Mizrahi or Ethiopian Jews or or Ashkenazim. So so even amongst the Jews, by the way, for the audience who might not be aware of this, they have a lot of divisions on racial and ethnic tendencies within Israel as well. So you feel that there should be some sort of unilateral sort of state for everyone, with Jerusalem as sort of the capital, and it's an international city. So wouldn't that sort of hurt the self-determination and the desire that the Palestinian people have developed in the last 70, 80 years? Do you think you have to let go of this? Do you think that and we're going into the territory of apartheid now, do you think that some sort of reconciliation, some sort of truth and reconciliation type thing has to happen, and the Palestinians also have to forego maybe their desire for a state, and is that what you're suggesting?
I think what I'm talking about is like a long-term vision. Okay, I think in the short term, first of all, we need a ceasefire immediately.
Sure.
There are people starving to death in Gaza. There are people who are dehydrating right now in Gaza. There are babies who will die in the next 48 hours because there's no electricity to keep them alive in these hospitals, because they require they require electricity to get this life-saving support. So we're talking about a humanitarian catastrophe right now. And so the first priority is a ceasefire in Gaza. And by the way, also the West Bank. Over the past 3 weeks, you have more than 100 Palestinians killed in the West Bank. The videos that were released this morning are honestly there's unspeakable tragedies being committed right now against innocent Palestinians, both in Gaza and the West Bank. And so we need to allow for a ceasefire to allow the humanitarian aid in. And then we need to look at a political solution. How is it that you include and incorporate the viewpoints and the perspectives of the subjects of occupation and the subjects of apartheid and the victims of siege? How do you include their views and their visions in a political solution? And because right now, what you see coming out of the Israeli press are these ideas, these half-baked ideas for the day after, the morning after. What does Gaza look like? What does Israel decide for Gaza after the war's over? That is the narrative. This is what Israel can maybe allow some Qatari or some Jordanian or some Egyptian or some Moroccan international force to impose its will on the people of Gaza. But all of these proposals are completely, again, leaving aside the Palestinians as if they should have no say in their own future. I mean, this is how we got into this mess in the first place.
Now,
and so
a lot of people would push back on that. Well, not here, not in South Asia, but a lot of people in the West, maybe, and particularly in your sort of ethnic community, would push back and say that Hamas chose this for themselves. That the Palestinian people, number one, chose Hamas through a legitimate election, by the way. And then Hamas chose this for the Palestinian people. So when they carry out acts of terrorism, this is what they get.
There's no question that what Hamas did on October 7th and 8th was gruesome, and it was atrocious, and every respectable person should condemn that. What is also obviously correct is that Hamas, over the past 35 years, has offered Israel 5 truces, and Israel has rejected every single one of those truces. The first truce came in 1988. before Hamas was even a terrorist organization, by the way. 2 months before Hamas adopted its infamous 1988 charter, in which it called for the destruction of Israel. You had Mahmoud Zaghlul, not Mahmoud Zaghlul. You had a leader in Hamas who put forward a peace proposal to then Defense Minister Yitzhak Rabin in June 1988, in which he said, if Israel withdraws from the Palestinian occupied territories, if Israel respects Palestinian rights and allows for Palestinian self-rule, we are open to peace with Israel. The same thing came from Sheikh Ahmed Yassin himself, the founder of Hamas himself, said exactly the same thing in 1988. If you allow for the Palestinian right of return and withdraw from the Palestinian occupied territories, we are open to peace. But those were never solutions Israel was ever interested in entertaining, because it was always bent on preserving its Jewish demographic majority. And in order for it to preserve its Jewish demographic majority, it was never willing to allow Palestinian refugees that it expelled from Israel back into Israel. So that was the first peace proposal in 1988. The same thing happened, by the way, in 2006, shortly after Hamas was elected. As you correctly pointed out, Hamas won free and fair democratic elections in January 2006. And those elections were observed by many elections observers and determined to be fair. And what did the West do in response? The so-called democratic West that supports democracy all around the world. What did it do? It punished the people of Gaza for partaking in democracy. It punished them by supporting Israel's blockade of Gaza. The United States and the entire international community said, well, you know what? Democracy is great, except when we don't like the people that you elect. Then it's not so great. And so but even after Hamas won that election, 3 months after they won in January, already in March, the political leader of Hamas at the time, Ismail Haniyeh, published this piece in which he said, we are open to peace. Withdraw from the Palestinian occupied territories. He said, grant us a capital in East Jerusalem, and let's come up with a fair solution to the Palestinian refugee issue, and we are open to peace. Khaled Mash'al said the same thing in 2008 and 2007. He said, we are open to a 10-year truce with Israel. If you grant Palestinians self-rule in the territories, withdraw from the settlements, make East Jerusalem a Palestinian capital, and come to a fair solution on the refugees, we are open to a peace agreement with Israel. And Israel rejected they didn't even reply to those peace offers. They were totally uninterested in coming to any resolution with Hamas. All of that, what happened on October 7th, 2023 was easily avoidable, but it did come at a sacrifice. Remember, peace always comes at a sacrifice, and Israelis were never willing to entertain that sacrifice.
I have a couple of questions there. Number one, what is the sacrifice that they would have to give up in order to gain a sort of more sustainable peace with their Palestinian neighbors, as well as citizens of the Israeli nation? You have a lot of Palestinian Arabs who live within Israel as Israeli citizens. Whether or not they're equal citizens, we can debate that. What is the sacrifice? Number one. Number two, a common narrative is that Yitzhak Rabin was somebody who was with the peace process, who was somebody who wanted to establish peace with the Palestinians, and that is what he was assassinated for. How partial are you to this sort of narrative and this sort of this whitewashing of Yitzhak Rabin? And that's how I would present it. The third question is, people like Ismail Haniyeh, Khalid Mashal, the whole organization, let's say Hammas, you have Fatah, you have the PLO. There is a sort of tendency in the West, as well as now in the younger audiences here in South Asia who are consuming Western media, to make caricatures of these people in their minds, because that was the U.S. foreign policy in the war on terror, with people like Osama bin Laden, with people like Mullah Omar with the Taliban, that these people have no real demands. They're religious fanatics, they're nihilists, they hate us because of our freedom, they hate us because we made the desert green, whatever. They hate us because we're Jews, and some unresolvable, completely irrational problem. So that's why we have to sort of dehumanize them and eliminate them from the face of the earth. So I understand why that narrative exists, but unfortunately, what do you think about, this is the third question, really, what do you think about when somebody says, when somebody sort of throws Hamas under the bus, throws Fatah under the bus, throws the PLO under the bus? What are these organizations to you as a historian, and what do you think they should mean to the people in the sense of are they the sort of caricatures that people have in their minds of Muslim extremist, jihadi, whatever, or are they real political entities who have serious political demands? So those are the three questions.
Maybe we can start with the first one, which is Oslo and Yitzhak Rabin. Was Yitzhak Rabin serious about making peace with the Palestinians? Look, I think in retrospect, we all understand Oslo's shortcomings. And it's easy to criticize Oslo now, but remember, in 1993, a vast majority of both Israelis and Palestinians were euphoric and supported the process. But I think as time progressed from 93 to 94 to 98 to 2000, the true face of Oslo showed itself over time, which was that the whole process itself could exist within a framework within which Israeli security needs were the most important thing. Everything else was subject to Israel's security needs, right? And which, of course, that's what Israel agreed to. That was if you go and read the agreements made between Israel and the Palestinians were allowed to have some amount of self-rule in small areas of the West Bank and Gaza. They were allowed to collect the trash. They were allowed to manage their own educational affairs. They were allowed to even police the streets. But again, always within the framework of Israel has ultimate security control. Israel can decide whether it wants to open and close a Palestinian town or village in the West Bank or Gaza at any point in time from 1993 to the present. No one ever checked that right on Israel. No one ever said Israel has to end the occupation. There was no, even within Oslo itself, there was never a discussion. There was never something that said Israel has to end its occupation. No, there was never even a statement that said this should lead to the establishment of a Palestinian state. That was never part of Oslo either. So, if you really kind of zoom out and ask yourself, what was Oslo? Oslo was a way for Israel to subcontract out policing and garbage collection and education and taxing within the territories that it realized it could no longer control completely. The first Intifada made that obvious, right? Palestinians break out an open revolt from 1987 to 1993. You have daily protests, daily strikes, daily boycotts, daily riots in which Israeli soldiers are being killed and Israeli civilians are being killed. And Israel realized it could not hang on to these territories forever. Territories that are 90% Palestinian, that Israel clearly is going to pay a huge price in trying to police and control forever. And so it became untenable in the eyes of the Israeli public to control these territories forever. We needed somehow to figure out a way of maintaining control of them within a framework within which Palestinians believe they have some type of autonomy. And that's what Oslo was. And if you listen to people like Diana Buttu talk about the negotiations from 2000 to 2007, 8, 9, she talks about how Palestinian officials would be traveling from Ramallah to Tel Aviv to take part in these negotiations, right? This is kind of this is sort of the legacy of Oslo, in which the Palestinian delegation, very high senior level officials, would be stopped at Israeli checkpoints and berated by 19-year-old Israeli soldiers, harassed, forced to wait in the sun for 2 hours with no water. And you're telling me this was a fair negotiation process? Because again, Israel's security needs are number one, right? That's how that within the framework that everything is subject to Israel's security needs, Palestinians can have some self-rule and some democratization and a small number of rights here and there. That was Oslo. That was the peace process. That was Yitzhak Rabin's vision. So that's to the first question.
But then, just a little follow-up, just a one-liner. Then the assassination of Yitzhak Rabin really speaks to the extremism of the right wing of Zionism, because if this kind of a sweetheart deal was unacceptable to them and it led to his assassination eventually, if that was the catalyst for his assassination, I mean, as a layperson, as an outside observer, to me, that is the catalyst of his assassination. His sort of softer stance on the Palestinian people and on the Zionist project. And that really speaks to the far right of how extreme the far right of the Zionist movement is. I mean, would you concur? Would you disagree? What do you think the reasons for his assassination were?
Yeah, Yigal Amir was a fascist. I mean, he was a follower of the Kach movement in Israel. By the way, the Kach party was outlawed by the Zionist Knesset, by Israel's own Knesset, because it was fascist and it was racist. And so, yeah, you have this movement within Israeli society that is only growing more stronger and more powerful over the past few decades, in large part owing to its demographic power, as Israeli religious people have more kids than Israeli secular people, and Israeli religious people tend
All
to be
religious people, all over the world.
this is universal, right?
Yeah.
So because their demographic, because of their demographic power, and which is only increasing, by the way, things are going in the wrong direction. They will become 35% of the population within a few decades.
Just a follow-up question.
Yeah.
So they're banned. They're an outfit that is outlawed, but and the Knesset, which is the parliament, views them as fascist, as hardliners, as racists, and you saw similar tactics in the Zionist movement back in the day, with them, outlawing Irgun and saying, "Oh, we disassociate with them," but then the dirty work was all done by Irgun. You see, organizations like Irgun and Lahi and I'm slipping on the name of the third one. So they did all the dirty work. They did all the stuff maybe that the rest, the more moderate population, didn't maybe want to get their hands dirty with. But that was something they were comfortable enough to turn a blind eye to. Do you sort of catch the sort of drift that I'm throwing your way, that maybe the sort of the agency with which these people operate within Israel, that they were able to assassinate a sitting prime minister, suggests a little bit of an element of conspiracy. And coming from Pakistan, I mean, I know a little bit of conspiracy when I see it.
I think today you could probably make an argument that some of the right-wing Israeli settlers are colluding and collaborating with Israel's own government. I mean, this is obvious today. Itamar Ben-Gvir is an active supporter and proponent of settler violence in the West Bank. After the Hawara incident a few months back, he came out in support of and speaking positively of the Israeli terrorists that committed these acts. So, today I think you have a good point, but I think in the 90s things were dramatically different. I mean, when Yitzhak Rabin was assassinated, Jews around the world, Israelis, almost I would say uniformly, were horrified. It was a real moment of tragedy in Israel. I mean, I would say there are very few moments in Israeli history where every Israeli felt some kind of pain. Again, maybe save for a tiny number of extremists and radicals, but this was a real tragedy in Israel at the time. Don't be mistaken about that.
Sorry. So as again, that was the whole point of me asking the question, is because you have such an intimate experience of this as a historian, as well as because of your cultural background. Was that in the 90s, this sort of left-leaning or more liberal tendency, was that because of the Soviet sort of post-80s, post-90s sort of Soviet, injection of Russian as well as ex-Soviet state Jews into Israel? Because I think they brought more of these sort of liberal sort of ideas into Israeli politics. So that paradigm was, I thought demographics would, and why did that demographic sort of go away with time? Why did they become irrelevant or unimportant?
Recall that for the first 30 years of Israel's existence, the left, the Labor Party, dominated Israeli politics. Okay, the Zionist movement, most of the early Zionists were socialists. In fact, some of them put their socialism before their Zionism. And some of them who joined the Communist Party joined together with Palestinian Arabs in the Communist Arab Party. And actually said this should be a secular state rather than a Jewish state. So, I mean, there's a long history of socialist Zionists before the State of Israel, and then after the State of Israel, the Labor Party was the dominant party in Israel, really, for the first 3 decades. And then Menachem Begin came to power in the late 1970s, and he represented the Israeli right. Remember, he himself was the commander, I believe, was it not Irgun, was Lehi. He was himself a terrorist, and he himself carried out terrorist attacks, including blowing up the King David Hotel, which killed something like 90-something innocent people in 1946, was it? So, of course, the Israeli right did not gain power until the late 70s. And then I think over the course, but still, the Israeli left was very powerful. And remained powerful well into the 90s. I think it was in the 2000s. I think it was the second Intifada that really radicalized many in Israel. Again, violence breeds violence. This is what we know in every instance of violence in human history. And I think in Israel's case, it was the second Intifada really beginning in 2000. So recall that you had 7 years of this Oslo process that ended in these negotiations between Israel and the Palestinians in Camp David and Taba in 2000, 2001. And we can talk about why those broke down. We've already talked about that a little bit. But those negotiations failed for a multitude of reasons. There was plenty of blame to go around all the way around. But those negotiations failed. And then immediately afterwards, the then defense minister of Israel, Ariel Sharon, takes a tour on the Al-Aqsa Mosque compound with his security entourage, in which he's essentially asserting Israeli Jewish control over the third holiest site in all of Islam and the most important site to Palestinians. And so he takes this entourage, asserting Israeli control over this very holy site to Palestinians. And the next day, there's protests. And in those protests, Israel slaughters 4 innocent Palestinian kids. And over the course of the next 3 weeks, Israel slaughters another 14 Palestinian children. There is of yet very little violence against Israelis. And then things break out. And then Palestinians engage in these horrific acts of violence, blowing up Israelis in cafes and buses. And over the course of the next 3-4 years, during the second Intifada, Israel kills 3,000 Palestinians, and Palestinians with Hammas and Islamic Jihad kill 1,000 Israelis. They had never seen this level of violence before. In the first Intifada, there were only 150 Israelis killed. Even throughout the whole 90s, we're talking a few hundred Israelis killed in these terrorist attacks. It was in the second Intifada where Palestinians started killing Israelis at a rate they had never seen death before. And that, I think, is what really radicalized Israel. It killed the Israeli left. It discredited people claiming that the Palestinians were a people open to peace. And it strengthened the Israeli right, who said the only language these people understand is force and violence, so let's give them that. And so from I would say 2009, when Bibi Netanyahu came back to power, until the present, the Israeli right has only grown stronger and stronger and stronger.
There's a sort of common trope that you hear in terms of narratives here, is that if Palestinian resistance were non-violent, they would never have to sort of face the Israeli right, and they wouldn't allow these sort of politics of hate to breed, and Hamas brought it upon themselves, and if the Palestinian people chose a non-violent path, because you describe these things as terrorist attacks, and while I would tend to agree with some of them, in others, I myself and people would say in South Asia and the Muslim community at large, even neutral, non-Muslim viewers would say maybe they're acts of a freedom struggle, because if you look at the apartheid state and I do consider Israel an apartheid state for the Palestinians. If you look at the apartheid state of South Africa, the South African resistance was also a terrorist movement. They carried out acts of violence, and while I do think that violence is maybe not as legitimate a form of political expression, but a desperate one, and I understand maybe that it's not as expedient as being patient with your captors and maybe playing nice with them and calling them master once in a while, but there's a strange sort of like a delusional element about this where people have like no sympathy for the idea of how desperate the Palestinian people or the people of Gaza are specifically. So how do you view the sort of political violence that Fatah and Hamas bring upon that? And I'm not asking you this complex, nuanced question. I'm asking you: do you condemn Hamas? Are you gonna condemn Hamas?
Well,
curse upon their houses.
Should I condemn Hamas before or after Israel kills my entire family and destroys my house?
Right.
I mean, I think that's the average Palestinian's attitude towards this question, which is, do you condemn Hamas? It's like, well, should I do that before or after Israel wipes off Gaza from the face of the earth? So, look, I think to this question around Palestinian violence and nonviolence and terrorism, and what words we choose. First of all, I'm of the belief that words are very important, and we should choose our words very carefully. And I called what Menachem Begin did in against the British in 1946. I called that a terrorist act. And certainly I would call what Hamas did in Israel, slaughtering 1,400 people, that's also a terrorist act. I think describing an action as a terrorist action is more defensible than describing a person as a terrorist, first of all. Second of all, I generally don't like that word, and I haven't, generally speaking, I would refer to Hamas as a militant organization. Generally speaking, I wouldn't describe Israel as a terrorist state, or I don't like that word because it's not analytically rigorous. Because when you talk about terror and the way it's used now, it's used by governments to delegitimize non-state actors. That's basically the way it's used today in academic research, among political officials, and in the media. No state in the world is ever described as a terrorist state, but why is what Israel is doing in Gaza right now any different than what Hamas did to trigger it? Israel themselves said, we are not going for precision. We are going for damage. They literally stated that the goal here is to destroy Hamas and to kill as many. And they've also stated there's no difference between Hamas and the people of Gaza. They're all human animals. We're cutting off water, food, and electricity to everybody. And so I think, how is that not terrorism? But again, so my point is that I don't think the word terrorism is actually a particularly useful word because it's not analytically rigorous and it's not applied to non-state actors in the same way it is applied to state actors. Excuse me, the other way around. It's not applied to states in the same way it is applied to non-state actors. And so generally speaking, I avoid the word. But let me get back to your question, which is what to make of Palestinian nonviolence. Look, long before there was Hamas, long before there were any rockets flying into Israel, you had a 20-year-long occupation of Gaza and the West Bank, in which Israel killed on average 32 Palestinians every single year for 20 years. There were no terrorists. There were no buses blowing up in Israel. There were no rockets flying into Tel Aviv. And yet the Israeli military is killing on average 32 Palestinians every year for 20 years, from 1967 to 1987. And what do you know? There's the first Intifada breaks out in December 1987 when an Israeli truck driver kills 4 Palestinians in Gaza. And what happens in the year after that, from late December 1987 until 1988? Israeli military personnel go into Gaza and kill 142 Palestinians in the first year. And guess how many casualties they suffered? 0. It was a nonviolent revolt. It was Palestinian kids throwing stones. Okay? And what did Israel do in response? It put 100 in just the first 2 years of the revolt. Again, before Hamas had committed a single attack on any Israeli civilians, which as far as I can tell does not start until 1990. It doesn't start until December 1990. But during those first 2 years, Israel imprisons 175,000 Palestinians. Okay? Israel breaks the bones. This was an order by Yitzhak Rabin, of all people. Break the bones of the Palestinian kids. You had tens of thousands of Palestinians whose bones were broken. 20% of the kids whose bones were broken were under the age of 5 years old. Okay? You had tens of thousands of Palestinians who were tortured in Israeli prisons. What the hell did you think was going to happen? Yeah, and so Hamas turned to violence. Of course they turned to violence. When you're being brutalized, when hundreds of thousands of Palestinians are being brutalized, of course you're going to turn to violence. And so again, you had nonviolent failed. All it did was lead to more Israeli violence against them. The same thing happened throughout all the 2000s. You have protest movements against the wall. So Israel builds a wall. Let's cordon off the Palestinians, lock them into cages. What happened as a result? In Bil'ain, and Nil'ain, and Nabi Saleh, and Sheikh Jarrah, you had nonviolent resistance movements, protest movements. I've been to many of these protests. They're always nonviolent. And what does Israel do in response? It uses lethal force in return. In Bil'ain, Bassem Abu Rahmeh was slaughtered by an Israeli military soldier who not only is not going to be condemned for it and will face no consequences whatsoever, but he will probably be rewarded for his actions. So you have dozens of Palestinians dying in nonviolent protests from 2003 onwards. Those nonviolent protests continue every Friday for years and years and years. And every few months or few years, Israel kills another nonviolent protester. You have the BDS movement, boycott, divestment, and sanctions, founded by al-Barghouthi, Omar al-Barghouthi, who says, let's build this nonviolent movement. What does Israel do? It declares it's anti-Semitic. It's anti-Semitic to boycott Israel. And then they try and deport, they try and strip the residency status of the founder of BDS himself, Omar Barghouthi, who's faced constant threats that he's going to be expelled. Okay, so you're saying Palestinians, when they violently...
BDSM, that was such a Freudian slip. BDS is... In a lot of American states, it's outlawed. If you associate with the movement, you can't get employment because they challenge it in a lot of local courts, and I think in some of the courts they're still in America. So I completely understand your position. I think you beautifully defined it as describing an act of terror and describing an individual or a group as terrorist. I do think, as a Muslim, as a South Asian, I grew up sort of under the sort of war on terror, the drone striking era. Pakistan itself lost 70,000 people, let alone Afghanistan, the refugee crisis. So I understand the word terrorist and the war on terror. These kinds of terms are sort of just whatever the state feels like, or state apparatus feels like. So essentially. You and I both agree on this, and I hope the audience as well would agree that if you suppress a people to a point where they're unable to express themselves politically, they're going to get violent. It's going to get ugly, and it's going to. And I think almost cynically, in both regards, the Israeli establishment, the sort of the deep state, the sort of the political class, they sort of want that to happen. They want it to get ugly because it's very easy to brush under the rug. First of all, they don't suffer many losses because it's not a very sophisticated attack that comes out of Gaza or the West Bank. No attacks come out of the West Bank, sorry. Any attack that comes out of Gaza is not very sophisticated, number one. So the loss of life, it can be mitigated against, and it's not too damaging politically, except this time it was. This time it escalated to the point that it was politically damaging. And the other thing is, I think that they even the anti-Semitism that rises in response of their response, I think they kind of bank on it. They kind of bank on the idea that, oh, look, such and such, because, and I think that ties in very nicely with the sort of hasbara and, how would you pronounce it? Hasbara?
Hasbara, that's correct.
Yeah, I find this to be a hilarious thing, by the way. What's funniest to me is that Hasbara has reached India, of all places, our neighbor, and they've become obsessed with Israel and the Israeli army and the beautiful IDF youth. IDF TikTok has, and Instagram has really sort of mind melted the Indian right wing. Obviously, it is much more complex than just social media propaganda, but. Do you think they're banking on this sort of the savagery of the Palestinians, quote unquote, in their attacks on October the 7th? Do you think that PR image, that management it slipped out of control this time? It's sort of the cat's out of the bag this time?
I think Israel plundered the greatest gift that was given to them in the history of the state's existence. Okay? 1,400
That's the most cynical thing I've ever heard in my life, by the way.
I mean, just think about what happened. For the first time, the narrative in the United States was no longer, it's complicated. The narrative was, we stand with Israel. I mean, every single American, who had no interest in Palestine, who never heard of Israel, literally these people couldn't identify Israel and Palestine on a map. They all start waving Israeli flags. We stand with Israel because they heard, wow, Israel had their own 9/11. This was the narrative. Was, oh my God, these people suffering from Islamic terrorism. They had the narrative. They could have really exploited that to do so many things they wanted. Bibi could have, pushed forward his judicial reforms. he could have probably gotten himself out of these corruption charges and breach of public trust charges and bribery charges. He could have gotten out of all of his political woes. They could have annexed the West Bank. No one would have paid any attention. They could have done so many things. They could have done so many horrible things, but instead, they had blood, they had thirst and hunger for revenge. What they wanted was dead Palestinians, and lots of them. That was the goal. That's the point of this operation, to see a high Palestinian death count. That's the goal. There's no other goal. What are you going to do? Reoccupy Gaza? What are you going to do? What's the plan here? There's no exit strategy.
No.
Israel's not going to. The plan is, I need a high death count on the Palestinian side so that my people think I'm tough. It's toxic masculinity is really what it is. So I think, and they really had the sympathy of people who, for the first time in their lives, never thought much at all about Israel-Palestine. And they
Speaking of toxic masculinity, the father of all incels, Jordan Peterson, gave them the green light to give them hell. He gave Bibi directly. He gave Bibi the green light. You had people like Ben Shapiro, shouting on all cylinders all day long about how they need to genocide the children of darkness, and no pun intended, by the way. But they somehow squandered that. You're right. They completely dropped the ball with so much. They had so much, support and PR behind them, and they completely fumbled it at the finish line. And they were like, do you think it's as cynical as just an incompetent sort of fascistic, right-wing nut like Bibi, because he has to boost up his PR, he just needs high Palestinian numbers, so he just bungles it up? Is that how simple? Is that how mundane it is?
I think on the one hand, the Israeli public was so shocked that they felt public pressure to go in and kill lots of Palestinians. That was number one. I think also they themselves had so much rage and vengeance and shame that they let this happen on their watch, that they felt that the only way that they would be able to survive this, what will likely become a political catastrophe in the aftermath of this war, that their only survival strategy was committing such horrific crimes against the Palestinian people that they could then claim, wow, look at what we did. Maybe we screwed up, but we made up for it. So I think there was the political calculus, the political calculation, the pressure on the part from the Israeli public, the warmongering. Remember, this is Israel's most right-wing government in its history. These people were committing atrocities long before October 7th. These people were they were supporting the people carrying out pogroms in the West Bank already in last March and last February and last July. So the idea that they would, double down on this idea of we need to, cleanse Palestinians, push them out of their homes, kill them, arrest them, deport them, that this was the mentality long before October 7th. So I think to pretend like there was going to be any other response than the one we saw would have been a little bit of a pipe dream, but here we are 3.5 weeks later, 8,000, 9,000 dead Palestinians later, with parts of the Israeli government putting out reports for advocating for ethnically cleansing the entire 2.3 million people living in Gaza and pushing them all to Sinai. I mean, that's where we're at now. I think what's going to happen over the next few weeks is that Israel will experience a very rude awakening. Already we're seeing a decline in support for a ground invasion coming out of the poll numbers in Israel. I think the numbers were in the 60% already last week or the week before, and I think now they're down in the 40s. Already less than half of the Israeli public now is banging the drums of war. So I think that will obviously decline in the coming weeks as Israel encounters a tremendous amount of resistance. I mean, have you seen the videos of the Hammas tunnel networks? They built an underground city they've had 10 years to build an underground city.
They've literally become the mole people. It's messed up. They've been preparing for this war for 10 years. If you look at the Israeli maneuvers in the past 2 days, they haven't even, if you look at the video footage that the Israeli military themselves have released, they're still in the buffer zone. They haven't even entered
They haven't even entered any of the areas that they claim to have wanted to enter already. They can't even get out of the buffer zone because they're being, their tanks are being attacked in the buffer zone and their soldiers are being killed in the buffer zone. So this is going to be a gruesome war that's going to lead to huge numbers of Israeli casualties. It already has. In just the first few days, Israel has tried to actually enter with its ground troops. Hamas is prepared. They're going to come out from behind, advancing troops. So, they can't secure basically a front line even because Hamas has tunnels where they're going to come out from behind. You have the Houthis now in Yemen attacking a lot. You have Hezbollah raining down bombs in the north. You have the West Bank, which is blowing up. So, and then you have the entire Arab and Muslim world now coming to the defense of the Palestinians. The same Muslims and Arabs who had basically abandoned them over in the Abraham Accords and in this Saudi normalization agreement have now all thrown that in the garbage and are like, we support the Palestinians.
Don't worry about the Saudis. The Saudis are still intercepting Houthi missiles. Don't worry about them. They'll take care of Israel. You see, the Abraham Accords was one of, and I have to give the devil his due. I mean, the Abraham Accords were Bibi Netanyahu, Trump, and the Saudi management were absolutely successful. They had ignored the biggest stakeholder, which was the Palestinian people, and they were going to get away with it. So, in a cynical sort of sense, if Hamas hadn't acted out the way that it did on 7th of October, the Muslim world, at least the Middle Eastern, like the Near Eastern, the Gulf states, would have completely gotten away with it. Even people like Qatar, even like states like Qatar who are on sort of the face value negotiating on behalf of the Hamas and they have their offices there. We know the kind of backdoor channeling that has been going on with Israel as well as with Turkey. So for example, Erdogan, who is the sort of the de facto Amir al-Mu'mineen or the Ottoman Sultan of the Muslim world, he was in open negotiations with Netanyahu. In fact, he had the first sit down with an Israeli and a Turkish prime minister or president/president in like a zillion years, and they were negotiating a gas line between the two countries and a potential direct trade route between the two countries. So you do see a sort of because all of these, even the monarchies in the Muslim world, have to depend on the social sort of structure where there's certain issues like the Palestine issue which are very sensitive. Funny thing, you see Wahhabism, which is, I'm sure you're vaguely aware of Wahhabism and the effect and the role that it played in the sort of post 70s and 80s international jihad and then the war on terror subsequently. You see a lot of the Wahhabi sort of intellectuals, I mean, the scholarship class, talking about how you can't go against the state and you shouldn't boycott the products that the state doesn't allow you to boycott, and then let the state figure out. You see the same people who would have been maybe cheerleading a war in Syria back when Al-Qaeda and Jabhat al-Nusra were being supported by the Americans and the Israelis and the Turks and the Saudis. You see the same people who were talking about how Bilad al-Sham is covered by the angels and their wings, and quoting all these hadiths about the glorification of going and creating chaos in Syria. You see the same people now begging a very religiously charged population, begging them not to sympathize with their co-religionists, to give them dua and to give them glad tidings, and that's about it. To not participate in any sort of political expression, of any sort of boycott movement, of any sort of I happened to go to the UAE recently, and I was surprised after the Abraham Accords. They have separate counters now at immigration for Israelis. So they used to have separate counters at immigration for Americans. Now they have them for Israelis, and I thought that was insane. I would never be able to see that in a Muslim or an Arab country, because I grew up with that sort of they're never going to recognize Israel, and there's going to be some sort of divine retribution for this, and we're going to have to figure this whole situation out. But you're right. The script is completely flipped, and that begs the next question, which is, Israel and America have a very similar relationship with that was enjoyed by Rome and Judea back in the day. If you'll allow me this presentism, when's Rome gonna get bored? When is the American sort of, because we're talking about Hezbollah and we're talked about the Israeli lobby within America and the West, but America specifically is very tightly sort of has a tight, the Israeli lobby has a very tight grip in American politics and in media. When do you see this relationship souring? Do is it a calculus of how badly do they need oil, or how violently would the Muslims react? Because we are a marketplace of 2 billion people. We're in
Yeah.
America, we're in Canada, we're in Europe, we're a part of Western civilization now. We always were, honestly, but now we're like literally citizens. We're part of the citizenry. Where the Turk is not the barbarian at the gates. He's your physician now. When is the sort of precipice or the tipping point going to be reached where they're like, maybe Israel is a burden on our foreign policy? Because I remember
Yeah.
one of the sort of anti-war guys, the Dr. Michael Scheuer in America. He was a CIA guy who led a lot of the torture programs even in against Al Qaeda in Afghanistan and Iraq. I think he was in charge of the Osama bin Laden Commission back in the day. But he was very anti-imperialistic. He wrote a lot about. I'm gonna cut it short, but what he said essentially was, if we drop Saudi Arabia and if we drop Israel from our foreign policy, we'll never have to deal with an angry Muslim ever again. I'm paraphrasing, but when do the American voters sort of realize this narrative, and how do they break out of it?
I think most living Americans today grew up in a unipolar world in which the United States was the sole superpower. From the end of the Cold War until let's say the late 20 teens, you could make the case that the United States was the sole world superpower, and so we didn't really need to think so carefully about the fact that we have all these military bases around the world, the fact that Social Security is going to run out of money in 10 years, the fact that our debt to GDP ratio is ballooning beyond control. But now the United States is no longer the only world superpower. We live in a multipolar world. Okay, China is expected to have a GDP of greater than the US by 2030. Russia is still a great power, as we've seen in the past year. And India is a rising power. The BRICS is growing and gaining power. The United States dollar is still the world's reserve currency, but that is increasingly coming under threat. And so I think what we're witnessing today is a complete shift in the in the world order. And the question is, when will Americans wake up to that? I think, look, the United States is now bogged down in Ukraine, committing itself to supporting Ukraine with military support and with financial support and with diplomatic support. That is a distraction. We're now bogged down in the Middle East. We're already militarily engaged in this conflict. People don't realize, but there have been attacks by Iranian-backed forces in Syria and in Iraq against American military bases. Our soldiers are dying right now as we speak as a result of the United States' support for Israel in this current escalation in violence. And so I think in addition to that, we've shot a missile, I believe, that was a Houthi missile. The United States has actually militarily engaged in this conflict already. Okay, so and what's the likelihood that this war is going to end in the near future? Probably low. And even if Israel ground troops are going to be in Gaza for probably many weeks, if not many months, the conflict will expand to Hezbollah in the north. The United States has promised to engage Hezbollah to prevent them from attacking Israel. So the United States is now bogged down in Eastern Europe. It's bogged down in the Middle East. How is this in our interests? The one thing I thought Americans basically agreed on was no more forever wars. That was sort of, I think we learned our lesson. We screwed up in Iraq. We screwed up in Afghanistan. No more forever wars. And I think most Americans, generally speaking, agree on that. And here we are, 2 more forever wars. And the real threat, I think the real adversary here is China. Okay, China is the real country we need to be paying attention to. They're the power on the rise. They're the one brokering agreements between Saudi and Iran. They're the one with the Belt and Road Initiative, expanding their economic influence in places like Pakistan, in places like India, all around Africa. including in the Middle East. So I think so the question is, when will Americans wake up to this new reality that we're living in?
You know who
Will it
picked up the
be
pieces in Iraq and Afghanistan? The Chinese. They've got all the reconstruction contacts. They just got a contract for all the northern mineral mining in Afghanistan, because they're offering. I mean, it's unfortunate as an American. I mean, I'm saying this to your face. I mean, it's not to be rude or anything. They're just simply offering better business terms. The Americans, they come with a laundry list of social ethics, and the women have to be like this, and the LGBTQ community, and this is the identity politics that you're gonna. They come with this humongous, like, insane manifesto and narrative that the local population just cannot, abide by, and they don't invest in infrastructure development, and. So China is doing stuff in Africa that the British Empire or the European empires didn't do in like 200 years. China is doing stuff in Afghanistan that the Americans didn't do in 20 years of occupation. So you're right that the American empire needs to recalibrate. I mean, and not just for the sake of empire, honestly. I mean, one cannot be, pro-empire. It simply is not a moral position to hold. But for sanity to prevail in global order, America needs to recalibrate. I mean, people like Nikki Haley, people like Vivek Ramaswamy. I mean, mainstream presidential candidates for the new American, election. They're talking. It's like they're regurgitating Zionist talking points. It's like they're regurgitating whatever Lockheed Martin, whatever the weapons manufacturer, whatever Boeing has said about the Ukraine and Russia war. I have noticed a bit of a trend. The bailout packages are not as attractive. I mean, the stuff that they were giving to Ukraine, they haven't even offered up to the Israelis. They do seem, they're not as gung ho as they used to be back in the day with the aid packages. Is that, am I misreading this? Is America stretched thin already?
Well, the United States has already guaranteed Israel a new aid package. Biden has come out and said, I can't remember the exact amount. Was it 15 billion, 18 billion?
Yeah.
Somewhere in that range, has already come out and said, we will replenish your arsenal of rockets that is being depleted. We will move our air carriers to the Eastern Mediterranean to provide you air support and defense support. We will provide you cover at the United Nations, and we will veto UN resolutions that are condemning the violence and calling for a ceasefire. So the United States is all in on Israel, and it's definitely not in our interests, certainly not our political interests in the Middle East. As we're seeing, we're losing allies all around the world as a result of this. Our soldiers are dying in Syria and Iraq because of this. Our coffers are being depleted as American infrastructure is crumbling, as our social service spending and social security spending is going to run out in 10 years, as we have more debt than we've ever had before, and as young people, for the first time in American history, are poorer than their parents. We are going in the wrong direction, and at the same time, as half the country believes that there was a coup, excuse me, half the country, namely the Republicans, maybe a third, let's say, believe that the election was stolen, that the freest and fairest democratic election in American history was stolen. And so I think
it's time
social media.
I think it's time for Bretton Woods too. I think you guys need to leverage the dollar against a central digital currency. The dollar against the digital currency, against the oil, against the international market. You need to come up with another trick.
Well, I'm glad you brought up Bretton Woods and the post World War II global financial order, because I think I think the world is sick and tired of of borrowing in dollars and paying for stuff in dollars and buying oil in dollars. Because what that does is it gives the United States an incredible financial privilege. Because whereas countries like Russia have to haul oil out of the ground if they need dollars, the United States just clicks a button and we can create dollars, as many as we want, to buy that oil that we need. And so I think what we're realizing is that, and what the world is realizing, and Pakistan, I would say, is very high on the list of countries that is suffering as a result of the global dollar dominance, which is that it's totally unfair that one country gets to print money and every country has to actually work and provide goods and services and raw materials and products. to get that same money. And that's unfair to everyone except for the United States. And by the way, it's unfair to the United States too, because it's hollowing out our industrial base.
No,
and it's leading
your
to
working
these.
class suffers much for this. I mean, your capitalist, your elite, enjoys your new techno feudalists like the Elon Musks, the Jeff Bezoses, the Zuckerbergs. They make billions or whatever dollars, but the Bill Gateses. But your working class, you're from the Midwest. There's some working class people. Appalachia, you got your Detroit type factory towns. These things were killed by the dollar being the international standard. I mean, do you think China wants the dollar to stop being the international standard? Chinese, this economist Yanis Varoufakis. You know this guy. He was the minister of
the Greek. Yes.
Yeah, he has some very genius ideas. He said, stop looking at like football teams. It's American capitalists and Chinese capitalists and European capitalists and what's good for them. You see, you have in America companies like BlackRock and Vanguard and State Street. They own like 80% of most capital that exists in America, which is insane to me as a third worlder. You know what I mean? I don't see. Sorry.
No, go ahead.
I don't see. I mean, to me personally, the Israeli project, the Zionist project, ties into this sort of this technology-based new liberal capitalist world order, because Israel is very heavily invested in a lot of these tech firms. Even I don't see how the American working class or the average American citizen can vote their way out of this one, because both of your parties, unfortunately. I mean, again, you're much more cynical, and you think incrementally we can sort of move the center, and then we can we can make small victories and that have more practical outcomes with that. But I don't see how you can incrementally vote over even half a century out of this problem. It's not just the wars; it's the finance for these wars that's the problem. It's the cycle of money that's the problem.
I mean, go back to the original, the first country to really pioneer, I would say, the strategy of funding war through debt was Britain during World War I. And it sold all these war bonds. And and we've been living in I think, in a world where the current generation doesn't have to pay for the war. And the United States citizens don't pay for wars. Guess who pays for them? It's debt holders. And it's the future generations, because we're taking out massive. You think the United States balances its budget every year? No, we have massive budget deficits every year. In fact, I think it was just in one day alone, we increased the budget deficit by like $260 billion just a few weeks ago. We're not. Who is paying for these wars? It's my kids and grandkids and your kids and grandkids. It's debt holders like.
No, but I'm immediately paying for it.
Yeah, right. No, yeah, exactly. Well, because so anyways, all of that is to say that it's totally unsustainable. United States military support for Ukraine and Israel is totally unsustainable. And it's the American people. I think it's the future generations of Americans, as well as the current generations in low-income countries and middle-income countries today that are paying for that price. So it's totally unfair to the world. It's unfair to the American working class. And it's ripping apart American society. We've never been more divided than we are today. Why is that? It's because some people are benefiting from the hollowing out of our middle class. Those are the people who sit close to the money printer. And some people are suffering. And that's your average American. That's Main Street. And it's unsustainable. And I think the call from right now is coming from inside the house. It's in the United States, where the greatest threat to American dominance in the world, it's not China, it's not Russia, it's civil war in the United States. It's being ripped apart from the inside. It's a threat of another coup. It's a threat of our electoral process breaking down. And and in my opinion, that's a much likelier threat. It's a much greater threat to the future of American prosperity than is some foreign power right now.
Wow. Very, very sad state of affairs. We're looking at a potential global conflagration. I don't want to say World War III. I just not. A, I don't want to jinx it, and B, it just sounds too corny. I don't like the sort of language, the World War language. It's a hysteria sort of language that I think is inappropriate. for these sorts of platforms. We're looking at a potential global conflagration in the Middle East. You see Russia and China sort of posturing behind the Middle East and the Palestinian cause. America is having its domestic problems. One would expect that they would be sort of strategically retreating and rolling back empire, but they seem to be doubling down, unfortunately, with these forever wars. I thought that with Trump and the sort of this anti-war sort of sentiment, I mean, it wasn't a principled anti-war sentiment. That much is clear because they were against the Ukraine war, but then now with Israel and Palestine, it's like, slaughter all of them and spend as much money as you can doing it. And so it might not have been a principled stance against perhaps an anti-war stance, but it was anti-war nonetheless. The people had felt the burden of the Iraq and the Afghanistan war, and then the engagement in Syria and Yemen and so on and so forth. It is a bleak picture. What do you as a historian, as an individual, as an American voter, any perspective, what do you think is the way out? And do you think it's even possible, whatever potential way out there is, for the immediate situation in Gaza, all the way to the macro sort of this bipolar world, or this, I wouldn't even say multipolar world, it's honestly a bipolar world. With do you think this sort of cold sort of engagement that China and China plus / Russia, whatever you want to call it, is engaging with the West? Do you think it's gonna conflagrate in the Middle East? Do you think it's gonna get hot? So how do we get out of this, both the localized as well as the global situation?
There's what I think, and there's what is likely to happen. Let me say what I think, because what is likely to happen is a completely different analysis. But what I hope and what I believe ought to happen is, again, first of all, an immediate ceasefire in Gaza, a return to a political process in which Palestinians have say in their political future. What is needed more globally is a complete American reorientation. We need to move away from the belief that we are the world's global superpower, that we are the world's policeman. We need to abandon that idea. We need to talk to Russia. We need to engage in diplomatic negotiations to end the conflict between Ukraine and Russia. We need to talk to China. We need to engage in diplomatic conversations with China to get them to stop these bellicose threats on Taiwan, to get them to end their persecution and their genocide against the Uyghur population. We need to apply, and then the only way we're going to have the diplomatic ability and clout to convince other countries to stop committing atrocities like Israel, like Russia, like China, is if we ourselves are committed to a foreign policy agenda that values human rights, that rejects occupation, that rejects apartheid. So we need to shift money away from military spending and towards diplomatic outreach. We need to stop spending $850 billion on the military. We need to end the military industrial complex and return to a sane foreign policy that puts America first, that places American citizens first, that funds our own social security first, that funds our own education system first and our own infrastructure first, before we fund wars and before we have hundreds of military bases around the world. So I think we need a complete reorientation, one in which American foreign policy lives up to the values we claim to speak to, and one in which prioritizes American domestic needs before it prioritizes military spending abroad.
That's very aptly put, and I think that one can hope that would be the response, but unfortunately that it's not going to be likely. You and I both have a feeling that is not where it's going to transpire. Give me the worst.
I mean, worst case scenario, United States is bogged down in another forever war in Russia-Ukraine, one that completely destroys the entire country of Ukraine, and millions more people, Russians, Ukrainians, continue to die there. One in which the United States is bogged down in the Middle East in a multi-front war that includes Hezbollah, Hamas, the Palestinian fighters in the West Bank, the Houthis in Yemen. God only knows what will happen. Maybe Jordan, you could imagine a world in which Jordan starts backing, some of these Arab actors, or Iran gets involved, or or U.S. military gets attacked to such an extent in Iraq and Syria that it sends more ground troops to the Middle East, that it actually sends ground troops into Israel. I mean, the number of ways in which this conflict could spiral out of control is mind blowing. So we're bogged down in the Middle East. We're bogged down in Russia, Ukraine. China takes over Taiwan. We lose access to our chip manufacturers and can no longer support our domestic needs, our domestic chip needs. So dollar dominant. So I think there's so many ways in which this, like, the current situation in the Middle East could really spiral out of control. And then we have an American election coming up in 2024. Just imagine if Trump wins that election. I mean, imagine the amount of internal strife. The amount. I mean, it would not surprise me if there's violence in the streets in the United States if Trump wins in 2024. The guy who's facing 4 criminal who's facing who has gag orders. He's the ex-president of the United States is forbidden from even speaking out publicly about his own cases because he's been issued gag orders. The guy may be in prison. There's quite a likely chance the guy will wind up in prison in the next few months. So I mean, the United States is really just totally gone off the rails right now, and I just really hope we return to a sane foreign policy and a sane domestic policy, one in which prioritizes the needs of the American working class, and one in which prioritizes the needs of middle class Americans, healthcare, education, social services, first and foremost, and we get but yeah, I don't think that's likely.
It's very unfortunate. We can hope and pray that you're wrong, but students of history are often not incorrect about their predictions about the future. Thank you, Zachary, for joining us. Before we let you go, we want to thank you for the sort of motivation that you have for this work, the fact that you pursued a career in academia. It's not really rewarding, I understand. But it's a moral position that you've taken up. You've gone against sort of the grain with your people, with the sort of ideas that you've been surrounded by. I mean, Hollywood, everything is sort of constantly pushing Israel as some sort of beacon of light, and the fact that you're able to cut through that bullshit and then come up with your own ideas, and then you have a fair grip on the language of Arabic, colloquial and otherwise, and mashallah, you have a very decent grip on the history of the conflict as well as the Palestine region in general. You're doing a service that Muslims or Arabs maybe couldn't have done for ourselves. You are our white knight and white savior. Thank you for. I'm messing with you, man. Thank you though for your service. It's pleasant. It's a pleasant. Unfortunately, Muslims have not invested in the liberal arts and academia because we've been pursuing medicine and engineering for the past 100 years because, well, colonialism. So, we wanted to learn the white man's technology. So,
thank you so much for having me.
No, it was lovely having you. Just a couple of quick things. For updates on ground and for sources that you follow for the conflict, just let the people know what you like in terms of sourcing. And where can they follow you? Where can they support your work financially and otherwise? Let them know. We'll pin them in the thing as well.
As far as following the events on the ground right now in Israel and Palestine, my go-to sources right now are the Electronic Intifada, produces excellent reporting. Ali Abu Nima is an excellent analyst of what is currently happening. I highly recommend watching him. They're putting out daily or almost daily YouTube videos on the situation. I highly recommend Democracy Now! Amy Goodman is bringing on the best people working on the ground in Gaza. I highly recommend watching every interview coming on Israel and Palestine from Democracy Now! And that's a daily news program. I would highly recommend Plus 972, which is an Israeli a magazine published inside Israel with Israeli and Palestinian journalists. Incredible coverage there. I highly recommend Al Jazeera, obviously, which I'm sure your listeners are already familiar with. Now, as far as if you want to follow me, if you want to follow my work, my my X, formerly known as Twitter, username is _Zach Foster. You can follow me there. You can also subscribe to my newsletter, which is called Palestine in Your Inbox. You can find that at PalestineNexus.com, and you can subscribe there. And thanks so much again for having me on, and thank you for all your good work.
Oh, thank you. It's very kind of you, very eloquent, and I think it was a very concise and sort of. I talk in a meandering sort of way, but you kept it concise and you kept it on point. Thank you so much, Zachary. I hope it helped the audience. Thank you. As we say in Pakistan, Allah Hafiz.
Okay, thanks so much again, and we'll be in touch. Take care.
Thank you very much.